Morning, Commissioner Sievers.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Oh yeah, it's not good morning, is it?
Time flies.
Time flies when you got things on your plate, that's for sure. Well, thanks everyone for agreeing to be on this committee and taking the time it will take over the next month or two to pull together our thoughts for our recommendations focused on transportation. Jeff, can you call up the agenda? We can stare out a little bit together. One thing just to note, I don't think we talked about this before, but these are public meetings. There's no opportunity for public comment during the meeting, but the public is invited to attend. And it looks like we may have a few members of the public that have joined us this morning. And today we're really going to be focused on kind of reviewing our assignment, the process, and kind of our expected products. Then we'll take a look at the preliminary subject areas that we had identified. This is a chart that you all saw at the commission meeting. But we'll just kind of go over that and see if some of the thinking that you've done between our last meeting and this meeting have brought up any more thoughts on the kind of broad topic areas that we should be considering and approaching. We'll talk a little bit about resources and opportunities for you to take a look at materials to help you prepare for the next meeting, and then the expectations for the next meeting. Jeff, did I miss anything that Okay, good. And are there any overarching questions from commissioners? Commissioner Lewis.
Oh, hi everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I just had sort of more of a kind of how big is this bread box kind of set of questions. How many meetings do we plan to have, and how much time do we have, in a sense, how much time do we have to work as a group and to contribute individually to meet our deadline?
Yeah, happy to give that an overview. So I think we've scheduled 3 to 4 meetings for this group. I think we've scheduled about 75 minutes for the meeting, so a little more than an hour. I think we estimated that, there might be as much as 6 to 10 hours of prep time, especially for our next meeting. Hopefully then we'll have some areas of focus and some key talking points that we want to make. And, Jeff and I and any others that want to can kind of contribute to turning that into the final product that we will consider, or the draft product we will consider at the next meeting, and then pass on to the we've been calling it the report committee, but it's really a kind of a synthesis and cross-cutting issues committee. But they will then synthesize the recommendations from the individual committees to get us, to a set that we want to kind of put forward and discuss in September. And then we'll add some time, between the September meeting and the October meeting. We will be able to kind of edit and flush those out a little bit. And I would say that you're able to put as much time into that as you want in helping with that. We don't want to rely on all of you or add to your busy schedules with asking you to, to take a role in writing, but we're happy to have you help us on that or to do some pieces if you'd like.
So thank you, Chair McDonald. So it sounds as if you're saying there's 4 meetings, but they're interspersed with sort of the larger process.
Yes.
So 4 meetings of this group interspersed with the larger process.
Yeah, Jeff, I think we said 3 to 4 meetings, but just to, I think we've scheduled 4. Is that right?
Actually, we've said 3 to 4 as needed, right?
Yeah.
But we've only scheduled 2
Okay.
so far. So we've got one set
Great.
for August 25th. And we also hope to use email as much as possible as well to kind of share ideas and do some homework kind of through that process.
Yeah. And apologies, Commissioner Lamb, I just called you Commissioner Lewis, so we can be informal about
it's
my
okay.
first names, but I do apologize.
No, it's okay. These things happen.
So I think that was a great segue question to kind of talking about the assignment and the timing. I think we covered the timing. If there are more questions, well, I'll say a little more about approach, and then we can dig into that a little bit. So, our intent in general isn't to recreate the wheel. There's a lot of great work that's happening in existing where are you going, Jeff? Are you you're going all over the map, but I'll go ahead and keep talking. There's a lot of great information, in particular over the last 2 years. I think there's just been a lot of work that's been happening across the board. The ongoing work of the rebuilding Oregon's transportation vision that the governor has established is going to be coming out with recommendations soon, and the Prosperity Council that we've talked a bit about, and the Data Center Advisory Committee. So there's just a lot of, as well as the energy strategy and a number of other documents that are in and outside of government that we can look at and see what we'd like to bring our voice to. There are times when we put something in that doesn't show up in anybody else's report. That's certainly important. We did that with the goals, and we've done that kind of with some of the green bank ideas and financing that I don't think has always shown up in other people's reports on a consistent basis. So the intent is really to kind of take stock of what's out there and then think about what is most important to add our voice to. I think we're expecting a product that will be a section of our longer report that staff and I are writing, but that it will be kind of a, really in a lot of ways, the most important piece of the report. We've kind of anticipate that it'll look something like either the 2024 biennial report or the roadmap in the way that the recommendations are structured. There'll probably be a kind of a headline section, statement with perhaps more details underneath it about specific elements that should be included and considered, and then a justification piece. Why is it important for this to happen? What could that help us accomplish? So that's at least what, the way we've been thinking about it. As we've discussed at commission meetings, I think we're hoping to be a little more explicit in next steps, and in particular, focus in on things that are going to be hot topics in the 2027 session. Transportation being one of those. So with that, I'll stop, and if there are other questions, happy to take those. Okay. Jeff, do you have the table open? I can always, if you stop sharing, I can share. So I have it opened. Let's see.
If you have it open, you can go ahead and share. Otherwise, I can do it.
Ooh. I hate it when I lose you. Let's see. Looks like you can see my screen. Is that correct? So just as a reminder, we have 3 topic committees, including this one focused on transportation. And then the synthesis committee that met, I think last week, that kind of talked about cross-cutting issues. We haven't quite gotten into how we're going to synthesize the recommendations, other than I think a comment came up at our last commission meeting that, you know, we've kind of organized ourselves to think about topic areas, but some of these things, you know, have lots of different ways they can nest. And so we'll probably nest, you know, we may end up nesting some of these things in slightly different ways. You know, that's kind of what the report committee will do. And this shows you all, you know, what's on the list for the other committees. This is the second committee meeting that we've had. We had the report committee. This is the second one. We have not yet had the energy committee meeting or natural climate solutions committee meeting. So these were the topics that we pulled out of, or that we talked about at our last commission meeting, and that kind of came out of looking at what we heard from Oregon Department of Transportation on their early findings relative to the monitoring report for the statewide transportation strategy, knowing that the rebuilding the transportation vision work group is meeting and will likely have you know, a focus on transportation funding and other items. I think they've also got kind of a review of different modes of transportation and how well those modes are meeting the needs to help think about allocation of resources, I assume. We heard both from Oregon Department of Transportation and from the transportation panel that we heard from about kind of the importance of pricing mechanisms. In particular, the idea of pay-as-you-go insurance pricing came up, I think, from both of those agenda items. Congestion pricing also came up in the panel. And there were other topics that are likely topics that we should be that should be reflected in here. I started to go through those presentations and kind of pull out more details. For example, the things that ODOT flagged as what they see as the kind of biggest barrier for meeting the state transportation strategy that might help us think a little more specifically. And with that, I will call on Commissioner Lamb.
Can we stop share screen for a minute and
Sure.
just be able to see each other? This is helpful to see, but thank you, Chair McDonald. And if we have time, before we get to the specific topics, which I think are, you know, reasonable topics, I have some big picture things that I wanted to put into the discussion. And I'm thinking, because this is my first year on the commission, so it might be briefly helpful for me to say a little bit about my background, because I have a little bit of an unusual background. I actually used to do climate planning at the state level. I was part of a team in the, we call it the first generation, in the 2006 through 2008 period. And we went around, we actually did depending upon how you count them. We did somewhere between 20 and 30 different states worth of climate plans. Later on in that cycle, I was actually involved as a consultant doing that. Later on, we actually were involved in the Oregon process earlier on. I worked with Brian Greger as a consultant. And Brian Greger was the one who actually introduced me to this analytical thing that he was doing that I know has been carried over into the STS called the S-curve. And I only mentioned that because I'm going to come back to that question. But with sort of, I have a sort of a deep background in this area. I think one of the big picture things I think that I've been trying to understand in the first year on the commission and as we go through individual agenda items at commission meetings is that I think it's the case, and I've been asking people if they can confirm for me, but the big thing is that I believe we have a gap. I think the news has actually covered one of our meetings where they've said there's a gap in the overall plan in meeting the goals by the 2050. And the question has sort of like been raised about some of the reasons. I believe, a significant part of the reason is like the reversal of a lot of federal policies. So I think that's hopefully something that people will agree with me on, that, both the changes in funding and in regulations have significantly altered the overall environment and the landscape for climate policy, and it particularly affects the transportation sector. So then the question to me becomes like, well, are we talking about the gap, and how are we talking about it, and how do we fill the gap? My personal view is actually that going forward, it could be more helpful to consider redundancy in the plan. The idea that I'm trying to describe is that, like, if we have a goal and a plan that meets the goal, it's like, it's like having a, whatever they call it, could be a three-legged stool, somebody talking about a five-legged stool, whatever it is, if you lose one leg of that stool,
You can
like,
sit on it.
yeah, it's like if you lose some of that stool, then you've missed your goal. But if you have a plan with redundancy, in a sense, alternative scenarios that exceed the goal, then you're sort of giving yourself like an insurance policy. And I asked one question one time of the folks who were kind enough to present. I know it's like we're doing like a lot of good work at the state agencies. But when we came back with a gap, because of my background in the transportation sector, I actually asked, people might not have understood why I was asking the question. I asked, it looked like the new measures that were being considered for the Tigger analysis were, at least the ones that I saw and noticed, were focused on marine and aviation. And that's all well and good. I'm not actually here representing any particular mode of transportation. But the concern I had, having done transportation sector work, is that most of the emissions in the transportation sector are from road transportation. So the other modes, aviation, marine, whatever you call it, rail, are actually very small slices of the pie. So I was concerned whether we were really backfilling the gap or not. So just with that big picture, but then also I wanted to ask about time, because I wanted to ask whether there would be time for us as a subgroup to invite and ask the Tigger team to come and talk to us as a subgroup, and to ask the STS team to come and talk to us as a subgroup. And I'm glad Suzanne's here. They were nice enough to have like one conversation with me to help me understand a little bit more what they're doing. And I promised them I would ask whether, do we have time for them to come and talk to our group and maybe ask questions of that work, which is good work. I just want to see how much time we have to sort of talk through some things.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
let me stop
Thank you,
there.
Commissioner Lem. We have talked about having agency staff come in to answer key questions, or to somehow answer key questions, outside of meetings. I think if we were going to have agencies come and make presentations, we would need to lengthen our meetings. And fine with that. I know it's challenging for staff to at Odo to, schedule longer meetings, but with all of us. But I think that would be fine. I think if we had some questions that we could pose to ODOT, for example, on this topic, there may be some that it would be relative easier for them to do kind of offline, or maybe not easier, but easier, time a little less time for us. I pitched a question to Suzanne and company this morning to try and get a better handle on one of the things that was in their spring report to us. So that's definitely something we can do. And maybe when we get to the last agenda item, we can talk a little bit about appetite for a bit longer meetings. Commissioner Steckler.
Thanks so much. I know as I was preparing for this particular meeting, I was trying to find quantitative information and really kind of understand what kind of progress we have or have not made since 1990. And so as part of the way that I've been kind of looking at this and thinking about it, I think of it there being, and the kind of information that we could provide that might be helpful, that it would be great to have both some outcome metrics that we track over time, and ideally it would be consistent across the other, the other topic areas or sectors. So for transportation, the ones that I've found in some of the materials are things like total greenhouse gas emissions for transportation over time. And we've got like 1990 and we've got the interim. And I was just trying to find, I know we're supposed to reduce by X percent to, I think it's 2035, and then, or 2032, I sometimes get confused, or 2050. So just kind of knowing like where our trends have been, and then where are we supposed to be by the next, time frame, and then finally by 2050, like that quantitative, not just the, the X percent, is super helpful for me. And so I was trying to wrap my head around and find some of that information. And I can't say that I was very successful in finding it easily. And I'm sure some of this probably is in the vast, majority of materials that are out there. But the greenhouse gas emissions for transportation over time, total greenhouse gas emissions per vehicle was another, and I'm forgetting exactly where, but it was in one of the plans as another kind of metric. Total per capita VMT over, so the same kind of time frame, and not in there, but it might be something we would want to consider is mode split. And I'm just thinking about the importance of having low carbon transportation options that we continue to invest in, walk, bike, and transit, and how that compares to, a vehicle or carbon emission types of activities. So outcomes is like one kind of big buckets, and being as simple as possible, I think is important. But then there's also just the different activities that we believe in. I think that starts to get into the topics like how much of the electrification or the other types of activities that we're doing to try to decarbonize transportation, and being able to talk about, what is the rate of electric, people purchasing, or the total fleet, or for, the different modes, whether it be train or aviation or, any other kind of thing that we might want to specifically call out. And I guess I just wanted to say a special emphasis on the pricing aspect, because there's a real opportunity, though it's, I think, a very politically challenging one, just because the state is going back to the drawing board on transportation funding, but price is a really effective, lever for incentivizing the types of vehicles we might want to see on the road, and disincentivizing those that are more polluting and have a bigger, kind of negative externalities. And especially as we consider Orgo or other types of programs, it would kill me if we didn't include the climate related aspect into that kind of calculation.
Yeah.
And so
Thank
Yeah.
you for that, Commissioner Steckler. I'm not going to put Suzanne on the spot today, but I do think I've seen graphs of some of the things that you were asking for, and I imagine that some of that, maybe the mode split information might come out of this rebuilding Oregon's vision work, because it looked like they were going to be kind of taking stock of that. But these are all kind of areas that we can put in front of ODOT, and they can either, send us the information or and join us and maybe clarify points at our next meeting. But I'll work with Jeff and Suzanne to come up with what what would be what they've got and could get us easily, and what might be beyond what can be done. And when you were talking about emphasizing pricing, I'm assuming that you were talking recommendations and not,
Correct.
yeah, okay, that was my assumption.
Or at least being part of the conversation, because if we wait until it would just be great to incorporate as much as possible as that the transportation funding commission governors group is kind of putting their evaluation and recommendations forward. Can we make sure that all of the pricing related elements that are in our existing kind of climate and transportation plans are considered as part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And before I call on you, Commissioner Lem, your questions that you sent in to Jeff and company and to me, one of the things you raised was, how did we think about the PSEF fund investments in the Tigger modeling? And I hadn't really been tracking the PSEF work as much as I should have. And I dug into that before this meeting, and it was really interesting. And it would be interesting, I think your question was a little more to, how does that kind of investment affect kind of state programs and or the way the state would think about investment? So I appreciated that you brought that up, whether or not we tie it to Tigger.
Thank you. No, thank you, Chair McDonald, for bringing that up. And I think some of this is just like shining sunlight on some things. I actually think that the work that has been done is quite sophisticated. A lot of effort has gone into these things. The more I hear about it, that's what some of these questions were, to like hear how the folks describe it. And part of it is just that we haven't had time. Like, we have only so much time at every meeting, so we don't really have time to like see how much is in these things. For the PSEF, that's certainly important, because it's come up quickly and it's a new funding source. But I actually took that as helpful information, because it's like, to me, then we would do these things where some things aren't quantified. So we would say, okay, qualitatively, no, that's on top. Like that's what I took from the answer about PSEF, is that if the focus is on state programs and policies, then maybe there's a little bit of overlap, but then 80% of it could be additive to sort of what we are showing with state programs and modeling, and that's okay. Right. Maybe we just say that, recognize that, right? Because if that's the way we're doing the work, that's
absolutely help people interpret what we're putting in the.
So, and to go back to what Commissioner Steckler said, I actually think I agree with many things. If I could just give one example and sort of pose the question to whoever's listening from ODOT and DOE, it's like, if you take these S curves are important, because like that, if STS and ODOT or even the energy and modeling is still doing an S curve, what you're assuming is that at the beginning of an adoption of a policy, it's sort of flat, and then you get this steep part of the curve where there's rapid adoption. And so that's when you really get the emissions reductions. So my question, if I were to just sort of pose it as a general question, is like, what do we know about where we are on these curves? So I was able to at least have a little bit of conversation with Tara and the folks at ODOT, so they were nice enough to talk to me. where like that's really the assumption. Like if you assuming we meet the goals, you got to wait till we get way up on the S curve.
Yeah.
And if the federal government is pushing us back down the S curve, like that's the problem to recognize, is that we might not be on the steep part of the S curve yet, where we're really reducing a lot of emissions. I'm doing this sort of hypothetically, but the best sort of concrete example for others is where you talk about electric vehicles. I did some numbers. I did some digging. Like Oregon's sounds like is in a pretty good place. We're like one of the top states for EV adoption relative to other American states. There's some stuff on YouTube that will say, if you go to Beijing, 50% of the cars are already electric. If you go to London or Sweden or something, they're maybe at 25%. We know it takes a long time to turn over the fleet. So the question then becomes like, if the federal government isn't able to give us money to help with the rebates or help with the charging stations or whatever we need to like get that rapid ascension on the electric vehicle curve. So like, where do we think we are? And then how much time do we need? I mean, that's the way I'm trying to think about it. Is that helpful? And I'm trying to connect it to some things that Commissioner Steckler said.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we can ask John Shedd to come back with, kind of discussion of where we are, how we thought about the different targets over time and how that may relate to S curves and how our consultants model works on that front. So we can pick that up in our next meeting or in advance of the next meeting and provide some background. So this is a great discussion. I mean, one thing that you brought up, Commissioner Lem, is that marine and aviation are some of the recommendations that are in the existing Tigger analysis, and we can also come back with some information on that and why we might not have seen some of the other things. Well, I don't want to hazard a guess, so I'll just leave it and we can come back. Because I mean, it's not a guess, but I might not get it accurately. I think that some of the existing programs are modeled in the other section, and some of those are the investments and incentives and things like that to accelerate EV adoption and the like. So that might be why we don't see them as much in the report. But I'll get John Shedd to correct my statement.
I'm sure John Shedd and Suzanne might be itching to say something.
Well, maybe if we get through the rest of our discussion, we can come back and hear from both of them, because I don't want them not to say anything, but I just don't want to one, I don't want to put them on the spot if they don't want to be, and two, I want to make sure that we kind of have a clear joint understanding of what we're trying to accomplish and how we're looking at that. So any other questions on, or do you want to stare at the topics again and see if there are some big areas that are missing, or ask any more questions about the process and products?
Can we look at the list again? Can we put it back up on the screen?
Yeah, you bet. It'll actually work faster this time. There we go. Oop. Did that work? Yeah, there we go. So the one that doesn't, well, maybe it fits into the transportation funding and pricing. Calling out congestion pricing might be an important thing to do rather than just having it tucked under those other topics. The other thing that we talked about, I think, oh, sorry, Commissioner Sievers.
Yeah, just a question about the electrification. In one of the documents, I thought maybe the terminology was ZEV, so zero emissions, and then we're jumping right to electrification here. So I didn't know if a broader starting point, maybe ZEV, and then that could include both BEV and, of course, coming from my Toyota background, we're still hot and heavy on the hydrogen. So like a fuel cell EV possibility in the future.
Yeah, good point. I think there's a lot to unpack under electrification and alternative fuels. So we should kind of extend the description of these topics before we meet again. Because to some extent, it could also be under clean fuels.
Sure.
It's at the bottom of that list.
And
Thank you.
the other one, the other point I was thinking with the topics there, I don't know if it's included with each one, but I think one of the key points for Oregon is just the geographic equity. So all of these are having maybe disparate impacts on various locations. So coming from a rural community on the coast, whether it's VMT or road usage tax or something, those might hit different areas, maybe not equally. But so I don't know where that thinking gets baked into either. Some of the closest thing I could find was the insurance pricing, and when I did research on it, it was indicating that drive-by mile was less when you lived in a rural area than when you lived in an urban area. So it seems like they've already baked in some concession that for any activities, there was going to be some travel going on. So I didn't know how we might bake that into some of the rest of the thinking.
Yeah, that's a great point, and could also be that people in rural areas just are a little more efficient. Don't think of, you can't think about going to the store every day. You can think about going to the store, once every couple of weeks maybe, and you're just better at it than we are. But it could be that there's some things that are baked in. So thanks for raising that as another issue. And I do think I imagine that we will take up equity as it relates to specific topics. And then we've also identified equity and affordability in the kind of as one of the cross-cutting issues. So I think we probably need to come back to that several times. And another question for Jamshed to help us with at the end of the meeting or next time. Our consultants can do a mapping, I think it's by county, of the different costs and benefits of policies. And I don't know that would necessarily satisfy us in all of this, but it might be, we might be able to pull some illustrations out that help people understand that either in a broad sense and kind of the issues between urban and rural areas of the state, and also maybe on specific policies. Commissioner Steckler.
Yeah, I guess, can you just clarify when we're thinking about this topics, I'm looking at the draft outline, the draft report outline in the memo from June 12th. That's the 2026 report to the legislature approach, draft outline and production schedule. So in that memo, like as we're thinking about these topics, is this kind of information that would be incorporated into multiple sections or multiple parts? So for example, it seems like part of this would be part 7, state climate adaptation resilience efforts. Definitely a good, like I'm thinking how much of this is just metrics, here is what we've done, as opposed to that part 8, which is recommendations that clearly calls out these these subcommittees. And so So I keep on thinking, really active transportation modes and transit, is that like, do we report something on the modes and make it a little bit more comprehensive? Or are we just focusing on what we know to think about recommendations in that part 8? So I guess, could you speak for a minute, just like how we're going to incorporate the work we do in this committee into the report itself? Like which sections will this inform?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, it will inform all the sections because, if we've got it's important for us to kind of take stock and report on where we are on different things. So we had a pretty extensive treatment of that in our last report. And then, also within the kind of narrative that goes with specific recommendations, kind of explaining where we are, justifying why we need to go further, talking about the specific elements. So, we have talked about trying to shorten the main body of the report or put more into appendices. So exactly how we end up using the information that we talk about here, I think will kind of depend on how the report evolves over the next month and a half. But definitely, all the discussions we have will help inform what we're reporting on. And I think especially if we have identified a really important area of work that we'd like to see happen in the 2027 legislative mode, having some more emphasis on that in the report. Part of the first 7 parts of the report, and then also kind of backing it up again in the recommendations. Our sense is that legislators kind of go to the recommendations, and so we don't want to take too much out of the justification section, in my opinion, and move it into the narrative if there isn't really an opportunity, or that if folks aren't able to go through the whole thing, and legislators are super busy. So
Absolutely. I know when it comes to like that revenue or pricing element of it, and I think of kind of some of the insurance pricing or even the clean fuels and how it increases the cost of fuel, and then what you can use that money then and spend it on those lower carbon kind of transportation related improvements, potentially, among other things. Like I definitely think of that bucket being together and potentially doing different things, like funding ODOT, funding so the operations and then maintenance of the system, capital improvements, actually changing behavior, which pricing is often one of the most effective and efficient ways of doing that, as we know, as well as then thinking about what are the other kinds of like equity and accessibility and that equitable access to mobility. So lumping all the pricing related things together, I think would be really great, because it's easier just to talk about them all.
Yeah, and we did talk about, and we've got on the report committee's list of topics, kind of a broader financing climate action. And, again, I imagine that some of the financing should be specifically tied to transportation, because we know that's going to be a really active conversation. But it also might get reiterated to a limited degree in the cross-cutting issues. That's the way I would kind of assume we might handle that. Commissioner Len.
So I'm sort of taking this. I have a lot of questions, maybe is one way to say it. And sort of my question, since if we're trying to pose helpful questions for maybe some of the state agency staff to think about, and if some information could come to us at the second meeting, or even if there's not time to present, if people could give us like a list of more websites, more to read, where to find the data, one big set of questions I have is like, what do the pies look like? So, that goes to something we were talking about. Like, it'd be helpful for the state of Oregon, to be able to see like what do the different modes, what is the baseline greenhouse gas emissions, and then what are the goals, like how do the pies slice out, and then that's when you see, that surface transportation is like the biggest slice of the pie. And then you start to like divide that into say light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles. And then you sort of see where your big targets are. I like the list. I think the list that we see here is very reasonable. Again, I'd like to sort of ask if then we can get some better understanding of how that matches against the policies that are already in the analyses. Like if there could be sub-bullets, then I'm actually like, are there strategies that are linked to each of these, including sub-bullets? That's a sort of question that I have. There are some overarching questions as well that I think I'm not sure. Maybe they're for us to discuss, maybe they're not analytical questions, but I've been sort of thinking, again, the biggest thing is about the federal drawback and then this question of resource capacity. In the transportation sector, I haven't lived here my whole life. I didn't grow up in Oregon, but just, in the last few years, it's been quite discouraging to me because at the regional level, we've been unable to pass the bond measure that was in 2020. Um, I was I was part of some of the committee meetings that were looking at pricing that ODOT was trying to do, and that was drawn back because that was the governor's decision to draw back. We may go back to that, but what each of these things does is it delays implementation. The
Yeah.
same thing with the gas tax. We've sort of had a series of efforts to try to like raise revenues with the gas tax. And we all might agree that these make sense to do for these reasons, X, Y, Z. But in terms of climate planning, it puts a different sort of impact because every time you have to wait 5 years or something, then that means you can't move the target year back 5 years. So then it does mean that we sort of have to readjust our thinking in some way. And my big question there is sort of like, how do we speak to that? And the best that I've come to, I'm interested in other people's thoughts, is that again, I think we should have more options. We should have redundancy in the plan. We should seek to have alternative scenarios so that if some of the scenarios don't come through, there are other pathways to meet the goals. And then Chair McDonald, you mentioned about the cost per ton. That would be helpful because also in the time of fiscal constraints, resource constraints, we would sometimes have conversations about where are the low-hanging fruit. So even without getting into all the numbers, like that's sort of like, again, like if you had 20 low-hanging fruit, but the cost of that was much less than one big thing where it takes a lot of money to get that big thing done. Are we that those are some of the bigger questions I have about for this
Yeah.
sector because it's tough this is a tough sector
It
as we
is a
know
tough
because
sector.
changing people's behavior doesn't happen easily.
No. A couple thoughts, and again, we can hear more from Odo and ODOT about these things. But one, I think it's been a little while since I went back and looked at the state transportation strategy, but it had some good breakdowns of the things that you were just mentioning that kind of give how much of emissions are coming from different types of transportation, aviation, marine, and ground transportation. It had a breakdown of the different segments of vehicles, heavy duty and light duty, and the rest. So there's some really good information in that, and I would suggest you might go back and take a look at that. And if if ODOT has a kind of an updated and a base document on the strategy, not just the monitoring reports that could be shared. I am not aware of that, but if you do, that'd be great to get. Well, this has been a great conversation. I will put my head together with Jeff, and we'll come up with a game plan of what we think we can get to all of you before the next meeting. Oh, I know what the other point I was going to make is in the Tigger analysis. There, we did identify a number of measures, and I think there is some redundancy potential in some of that. Maybe not quite enough, but there are at least different options for making things happen. So we can hear more about that. But maybe we'll go to a little more specific on next steps, and I'll try and summarize what I've said and what I've heard from all of you. So you can go ahead and take the well, it's me. I can go ahead and stop sharing, and then we can see each other. Sorry. I think we're hoping that we'll be able to dig in deeper on the topics and subtopics that we want to hit, better define what they mean other than just a word, or but maybe add a short paragraph to what does this include, so there's a scope. Make sure we've got any other documents that might be good background, and then we can take some of the questions that were posed to ODOT and ODO to try and get some material in advance. I just worry that our meetings might not be quite long enough to cover all the topics. That is, but we can also, I think we'll have a little time today to hear from our colleagues at ODOT and ODO on some of the questions you asked, but then we can maybe follow up in writing. And I also see that the EQ is on with us, and they may have some good comments to add, and sources of information on transportation that we could include. So our expectation for the next meeting is not to get to a full-blown recommendation, but to better define and make sure we all have our heads around what the key topics are. And then between now and then, I think any questions that come up for you, if you can send those to Jeff and I, and then we can disperse those to appropriate agencies, and figure out a game plan for getting that in front of us. If an agency has a document they can just send us, or key paragraphs out of documents that they can just send us, that's probably easier for them. If they have to write something new, it might be easier for them to just come and try and answer questions. So we can kind of come up with a game plan for that.
Can I say thank you to Jeff and to the folks? I was actually surprised when I got the reply to my email question. So you all obviously had to do a good amount of thinking and talking in the background to get a reply together. I really appreciate how much goes into that. So thank you.
Absolutely. And ODO has been great in providing support to the commission throughout, and in particular now that there's a little more capacity at ODO for our work, but we always get more than what we're technically allocated to use. So at least in my view. So I do appreciate that as well, Commissioner Lim.
And I'll just admit I have some reading to catch up on. So that's on my list, is to go through what's already on the websites and all the past reports. My first year on the commission, I have a lot to catch up on. I'll readily admit that.
Well, it's covering topics across all sectors, especially, when you're coming from a background mostly in one sector or a couple of sectors, it's challenging. And I think we all have more things to catch up on, no matter how long we've been on the commission, but appreciate that and appreciate the work that you're doing towards making that happen. There's one more thing about expectations. Sorry, escaped my mind. So if that's if that's all, the kind of discussion we want to have, then we can open it up. And I can go back and I imagine that John Shed and Suzanne wrote the questions down, but also don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to address some of the things that might be simpler, and we've got another 15 plus minutes, so we can kind of go back and forth. But Jamshed, do you want to just start off on the Tigger work and S curves and kind of the question that I may have stumbled answering on why some of the ground transportation doesn't appear in the additional recommendations section?
Sure. Thank you, Chair, and to all the commissioners for the opportunity. So I think, as many of you know, Tigger is, of course, sector-wide, right, statewide, and doesn't look at the progress toward meeting any sector-specific goals. So we're looking at the broad goals that are laid out in Executive Order 20-04 for 2035 and 2050 emissions reductions. And so when we went through that process, right, we had that first part, which was taking a look at all the statewide programs, assessing the emissions reductions we were going to get from them, and then we moved on to this sort of gap measure and scenario phase where we looked at, how can we potentially meet the gap. Now, as the chair noted, there is some redundancy built into it, broadly speaking, in terms of all of the gap measures that we have, which do not constitute a plan or any sort of strategy in terms of how we would meet the goal. But if you could take combinations of them based on the amount of GHG emissions reductions that were calculated, you could meet the gap that we identified across all the sectors. For the transportation sector in particular, and really for all the gap measures in developing those and the scenarios, here at OTA, we're obviously not experts in all of these particular sectors, and not aware of all the particular activities that you could take to drive down emissions. And so we relied on other state agencies. We relied on public comments. We relied on our consultant to an extent. We relied on some of what was put forward in the previous Tigger report that was issued in 2023 to develop those gap measures. And so, I don't want to speak for, and I won't speak for other agencies, but I'll say, one of the things that was clear because of when we started this project last year was that federal impacts were going to be significant in the transportation sector, and ACC2 and ACT were one of the big ones. And so one of the fundamental tenets of Tigger is we assume that the programs and regulations that we have in effect are going to be successful, and that extended to programs that have a lot of uncertainty around them, like ACC2 and ACT right now. And so, we assume success on those programs, and that's sort of built into our forecast. But one of the things we did in the scenarios was say, well, what if those EV adoption rates for ground transportation are a lot less than what we thought? And you can see that those, emissions, of course, go up somewhat considerably. So I don't want to speak for why there's not more sort of ground transportation measures in particular that were offered to us, as part of that gap measure development process. But I think a decent amount of it has to do with the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty around the measures the programs that we already have. And in this environment, thinking about, adding more to that when what's existing is already very uncertain that we're even going to meet those targets that were established, I think is part of the reason why. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be more analysis about what happens if those EV adoption rates are higher. But but I think the comparison of what we did in the BAP forecast, the forecast of all the programs in place versus the scenario of what happens if you take those away shows some of the impact that those EV adoption programs and that uptake is going to have, or you know, if they're not, if they're not implemented fully and successfully as planned, you know, what the ramifications of that would be. And, you know, my counterparts at other agencies may have some other, you know, thoughts on, you know, the potential for other sort of activities around the, you know, electrification of vehicles there. So that was one question. In terms of the S curves, I think part of it is we'll have to discuss a little bit with our consultant about the trajectory. It really depends on the measure, though, and the particular program that you're looking at, for them to determine sort of what the rate of GHG emissions reductions were. Different programs have different sort of milestones, you know, along the way to meet, and so their modeling sort of ramps that up. Sometimes in different ways, depending on the program that we're looking at. But because they ultimately model for success in these programs, you know, whatever that target is in whatever year that is, they're going to meet that. And absent, you know, other, you know, milestones along the way, it's usually a relatively gradual, you know, ramp up and a steady sort of sloping ramp to get to the success of these programs and whatever target date that is built into the program itself. So we can go back and get more information, especially if there's particular programs or regulations or activities that, you know, you're interested in understanding sort of how that was modeled and on what rate per year or over the course of years that was modeled. That's something we can certainly ask them. The last question that I had here was about the sort of geographic distribution, urban, rural areas, and emissions there. So our consultant does have some capacity to look at emissions in different areas and the impact of different activities in different areas of the state. That's not something we've done a lot of in the TIGR analysis so far, but it is something that we can go back and ask for, depending on the question they may you know, have the data available to do that, because we've, you know, largely done this as a statewide, you know, effort. We haven't focused necessarily on any particular areas of the state, but their modeling does have the ability to do some of that. So if there's particular questions about that, we can certainly take it back and see what they can provide us. I would be happy to do that.
Shamshed, in TIGR 1.0, we did MAC curves. Are we going to get updated MAC curves? So that could also, I can't remember who brought it up, but maybe it was you, Commissioner Lem, or Commissioner Steckler, the kind of impacts and benefits or the impact of different policy levers and what it could do in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction. And if you wanted to kind of just take a look at how it came out last time, you could go back to the TIGR 1.0 report.
So cost is not a factor that we're really taking into account with this version of TIGR, and that's in part because of so much the work was done in the energy strategy and the pathways that were identified the pathway that were identified to meet our energy goals in the energy strategy are very consistent with what we've done in TIGR, and many of the gap measures and things that were assumptions in the energy strategy were built into TIGR. There's going to be some information on the benefits, the health benefits in particular, using some the EPA COBRA modeling, but we didn't get into the costs associated. There's a lot of variability there, depending on, especially with the gap measures in terms of how you formulate them, that we didn't get into that analysis here. It could be the subject of a future one, but that generally is not part of this iteration of the project.
How would we get a MAC curve if we didn't include cost?
Yeah, the previous version of TIGR, I understand, had some of that included.
Yeah, okay.
This one doesn't, right?
That would maybe
so we would not
be
have that
place to go. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. But I imagine that it wouldn't change hugely in just a couple of years. But certainly a place that folks could go to kind of refresh your memory of what kinds of measures had bigger impacts and had more bang for the buck, so to speak. See Suzanne, are there pieces that you want to tackle of some of the questions that came up? You may be. You are on mute. Maybe she had to step away. Oh, great. Jen, can you, or Jeff, can you promote Suzanne to presenter? Please.
She should be able to unmute herself now.
Here we go.
Great.
Great,
Thank
thanks.
you. Thanks for joining us today.
For sure. Yeah, good to see you all. Good conversation. I like the part where you weren't going to put me on the spot because I was joining and taking notes, but not expecting to be part of the conversation. So I can give you a little update maybe on our process. And then I think if we collect all those good questions, because some of them are a bit more technical. And unlike Jamshed, I'm not quite in the work to give the rundown and response. And some of it may not be known or we may not have results to share just yet. We came to the commission, I want to say April. Is that right? Yeah.
April. Yep.
Yeah, great. And we shared the report card. So as far as where some of the specific strategies are around the statewide transportation strategy, greenhouse gas vision for 2050. And we're continuing to do modeling and prepare to present that information publicly via our webpage. Our release of that is so far anticipated to be at our September Oregon Transportation Commission meeting. And then coming to you, the timing didn't quite work out because I want to say your meeting is just before that. So we're looking to come back to your full commission in October. And once we have that information on the website, we'll also be accepting feedback and questions and have some contact information there as well. So I think we could collect for Commissioner Matt Lem, some of the background material and websites and probably provide some links there. And then I heard a lot of specifics around the metrics and outcomes and what info we have there, which I'd like to just get with the team and see what info we have and make sure we're getting that accurately. And then I also heard questions on the transportation working groups, and I have not been a part of that. So I've heard them present out, but that would be another one where I'd like to get specific questions and see what they have ready to share. They will be presenting, the subcommittees are presenting to their own working group, the higher level group, on August 7th. So that would be another time to check in and join them for that meeting. That said, did you have any lower hanging question that you thought I might be able to address here?
Those were the things that I kind of, go ahead, Commissioner Lem.
Sorry, just to clarify, when you're talking about your do you have subgroups for your STS process? Is that what you're referring to, Susan?
I quickly jumped topics. No, that's for the transportation working groups, the governor's transportation working group. They have six, I want to say it's 6 subcommittees.
Okay.
And those groups have been meeting and they'll be bringing their information back forward for updates on August 7th. So not for statewide transportation strategy, no.
I understand what you're referring to.
One thing I just want to flag for you, Suzanne, I imagine we are going to have to dedicate a fairly significant chunk of time to finalizing our recommendations and voting on those. So I don't know how much time we will have, but if your materials are going to be shared with your commission and I assume posted on your website, maybe not at the same time, maybe that comes afterwards. We can take a look at what you send out for public comment as soon as it comes out, and then maybe do a little quick reconnoitering with you offline, because I'm not saying you won't be able to present in October, but I just I'm just being mindful that agenda might be pretty packed. So we'll do the best we can to make sure that we can cover this important topic.
Thanks, Chair McDonald. And I think it may be more timely as well, that when the information comes out, it'll be available for the group as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Lem?
Can I just ask a question this way? Because part of it is sort of me sorting out sort of like whose responsibility is what. So if I were to pose this question this way, whose responsibility is it to think about mitigation measures to the climate measures? we've had some discussions at the OCAC, and I think in some ways it's been the rapidly evolving political environment that's made me think of this. It's like when they talk about VMT, per capita VMT reduction, like we start to get in this conversation about like, well, you don't want people that you're not saying to people you don't want them to get to their jobs, or so like whose role is it to think about in terms of maybe considering for potentially folding into recommendations things like, well, if somebody didn't have a transit option, could you give them a voucher for a Uber? Or some kind of income-related mitigation measure or a geographic, like if people don't have alternative mode options in certain parts of the states, we don't want to say that we're leaving them out. I know the modeling is done at the state level,
Yeah.
so that's helpful to clarify and confirm. But then,
Yeah.
is that more of a OCAC discussion that's over sort of layered on top of the modeling? Is that the way I should think about it?
I would think that it's, it's something we should be thinking about. I assume that OTC thinks about it. Obviously, the governor's office and the rebuilding the vision the group will need to be thinking about it. Legislators will think about it. So I don't know. My answer would be that's a super important issue and we better all be thinking about it. Now, are we the experts to figure out the details of that? Probably not.
Probably not.
If
Right.
if another agency or commission like OTC comes up with a really good way of kind of addressing some of those issues, or the rebuilding the vision group does, then those are the kinds of things that we can pull in. And we won't be able to get as specific as we would like on every topic, either because no one knows it or we didn't know they knew it or had come up with it. So we'll have to kind of do our best, and where it might be important to raise that as an issue, we can raise it as an issue in kind of the overall considerations that the governor and legislators should think about.
Yeah, if I could, sorry, Commissioner Stickler, if I could just, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine us not wanting to say something to at least recognize the question, and we do have, like, we know that for some of the EV rebates, some programs can be income-based so that you sort of at least have the income equity where you sort of say to qualify a rebate, you're in this income category. So we're already, it's sort of a matter of just degree. I think just recognizing this issue that we want to have something that encompasses, that doesn't leave anybody out, that encompasses, everybody in the state, wherever they live, whatever their situation. I think if we'd probably at least want to say some things qualitatively, I would imagine, right?
Right. I think you're right. And, I think we can find some statistics. I know, we heard from the panel, the number of people that support the idea of active modes of transportation, and, what percentage of Oregonians don't or can't drive, either because of access to vehicles or disabilities, age. So, there are factoids that we can kind of pull in to provide context for a recommendation in different areas. Commissioner Steckler? Nope, you're on mute.
There we go. I guess the way that I've always thought about it, especially for the role of this particular commission, is to first and foremost think about the greenhouse gas emissions implications of whatever the policy or pricing or program or strategy kind of ultimate goal. But then recognize, if you do this to be the most effective at reducing that emissions, there's other externalities to that, and we should not be blind to those. And there could be equity or low, other kinds of income, or it could fall differently on populations in rural areas versus urban areas. So I think it's important to start the conversation with, here's the greenhouse gas emission implications, but then here's the other things we should also be paying attention to. And I think that's important as well.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I believe we're at time now. And really appreciate the great discussion. here. For those members of the public that are with us, all of the meetings that have been scheduled for this committee are on our webpage in with the regular commission meetings. So there are a lot more dates on there and times. So it's a little harder to find things, but I think they're well labeled, but just there are just a lot of things to look through now. As I said, well, we don't have time for public comment at this meeting. Our next commission meeting is the 14th, and we will make time for public comment at that meeting. So with that, anything else for the good of the order, Jeff?
No, I think that was a great discussion. We just recommend folks to kind of dig into the content of both the prior commission report that was put out in 2024 to see how those recommendations were couched and the supportive rationale for those recommendations. That kind of really helps provide context of what we're going to be looking for. The second thing is there was a policy compendium that was attached to our last email, and that's got a list of transportation related policies that are either from the energy strategy, from prior commission reports, and also provides links to the STS work. So there's plenty of resources there and links to look at. As part of that email, there was also a list of all the commission meetings we've had where various topics were discussed. So we had a couple of transportation panels. If you want to go back and listen to anything or look at resources that were posted to those websites, you can click on the links and get that information.
Great.
That's
Thank
it.
you, Jeff. With that, I will adjourn this committee meeting of the Oregon Climate Action Commission. Thank you.